If they're all cleaned up like it's supposed
Okay, this is going to get some water. Sorry for the trouble. Yeah.
What do y'all think? People more or less here.
Can you hear me? Welcome to Digital Means, Political Ends, and Academic Freedom in the New Gilded Age, a conversation with Stephen Salaita. My name is Josh Dubler. Thank you all for coming. Stephen Salaita is the sort of scholar for whom the duties of the profession and the duties of citizenship are not so easily disaggregated. His research agenda seems driven less by vicissitudes in his field than by historical emergences and emergencies. Salaita received his PhD in 2003 in English at the University of Oklahoma. In the decades since, he has published 6 peer-reviewed books on topics ranging from Arab literature to anti-Arab racism in the United States to the politics of Israel and Palestine. As a scholar, Salaita is also an activist, a Palestinian American by heritage and identification. Salaita has been active in efforts to mobilize scholars to fight for justice for Palestinians. He is prominent in the BDS movement, which seeks to exert pressure on Israel in support of Palestinian sovereignty. And last year, he was a public presence in debates within the American Studies Association that led the ASA to endorse a boycott of Israeli academic institutions. Without this outspoken advocacy, Stephen Salaita would not be in Rochester today. He would be at the University of Illinois, where last October he was offered a job that was set to begin last month. But Salaita's activism earned him adversaries. I assume our guest is fairly tired of hearing about the following sequence of events, but as convener of today's event, I feel compelled to rehearse them. The story begins world historically. On July 8, 2014, Israel launched Operation Protective Edge into the Gaza Strip. In the next 7 weeks, more than 2,200 people were killed, the overwhelming majority of them Palestinian. Unlike earlier conflagrations in this conflict, in 2014, the dissemination of digital technology on the ground and the popularity of social media here at home made emotional disengagement hard to sustain. Facebook and Twitter became a barrage of polemic and apologetic speech. On Twitter, Salaita was a vocal participant. At times, his speech was flat and earnest. At others, he was aphoristic and hyperbolic. Styles favored by a form where whatever one needs to say must be said in 140 characters or fewer, and where, amidst the constant flood of chatter, it is sometimes difficult to be heard. On July 21st, the conservative website The Daily Caller posted a piece on Salaita entitled, "America 2014, University of Illinois Professor Blames Jews for Anti-Semitism." The piece focused on something Salaita had tweeted 3 days prior. I quote, "By eagerly conflating Jewishness and Israel, Zionists are partly responsible when people say anti-Semitic shit in response to Israeli terror." About this claim, people may reasonably disagree. But the Daily Caller piece was not such an exercise in careful reading. It compared Salaita's intensified vitriol since the war's commencement to, quote, "a toddler's fit over a toy." Its goal was to shame the University of Illinois for hiring, quote, "disgusting scumbags like Salaita." The piece was much more effective than that. Beginning that day, according to documents released by the University of Illinois under the Freedom of Information Act, University of Illinois Champaign Chancellor Phyllis Wise and the Board of Trustees began receiving emails opposing Salaita's appointment. Some of these were from people who had previously donated large sums of money to the university. After a meeting with one of these individuals, Wise reported back the donor's comment that the university's handling of the case would be very telling. On August 2nd, without consulting the dean or the chair of American Indian Studies, Wise wrote Salaita and informed him that his job had been revoked. Across the humanities and social sciences, faculty was incensed. A barrage of thoughtful letters expressing concern poured into Chancellor Wise's office from individuals, collectives, and professional associations. Over 5,000 scholars from a range of disciplines and at various levels of professional advancement signed petitions pledging to boycott the university until the Salaita situation had been rectified. A great deal of intelligent criticism was published in high-profile venues. And for those of you who are interested, I will link a lot of this on the Facebook event page. Regardless, on September 11th, by an 8-1 vote, the Board of Trustees rejected Salaita's appointment. The rallying of scholars in Salaita's defense may thus far have come to naught, but as sound and fury, it signifies a great deal. Both for scholars seeking to change the world and for scholars concerned merely with keeping their jobs, the Salaita affair is a parable for the academy in these challenging times. The questions it raises are many. How might scholars with political commitments best advocate and organize? What opportunities and perils do digital media present? Does what one writes on social media belong to one's private life, or does it become part of one's scholarly portfolio? What sorts of speech does the principle of academic freedom protect? What speech is exempt, or maybe whose speech is exempt? And perhaps most crucially, in an era of the academic precariat, weakened public sector institutions, and hyper-empowered economic elites, just how sacred a principle does academic freedom remain? To think through some of these questions is why we're here tonight. This event is made possible with the generous support of 12 University of Rochester entities: American Studies, Anthropology, Art and Art History, English, Film and Media Studies, the Frederick Douglass Institute for African and African American Studies, History, the Humanities Project, Philosophy, Religion and Classics, the Susan B. Anthony Institute for Gender and Women's Studies, and Visual and Cultural Studies. Eitan Friedenberg designed the poster and set up the Facebook page. The ISO, SDS, and the Undergraduate Religion and Classics Council helped with promotion. Thanks as well to folks at Hillel for their constructive feedback. The magnitude of the support this event has received speaks to its many resonances. To help draw some of its nestled issues into relief, I have solicited comments from 3 local scholars. Ted Brown, an historian here at Rochester, Lisa Cerami, who teaches German at Nazareth, and Tom Gibson, a U of R anthropologist. For his activism in the Socialist Caucus of the American Public Health Association, his outspoken advocacy for universal single-payer health insurance, and as a founding member of the Rochester chapter of Jewish Voices for Peace, I have asked Ted Brown to speak on what Stephen Salaita means for scholarly activism. Because she authored a solidarity petition in support of Dr. Salaita for contingent faculty, I've asked Lisa Cerami to speak on the issue of academic labor. As former chair of the U of R chapter of the American Association of University Professors and former chair of the Faculty Senate, Tom Gibson will shine some light on academic freedom. To conclude, and then we'll hear from Professor Salaita. To conclude, 2 comments on how I opted to frame this event. The New Gilded Age I took from Paul Krugman's NYRB review of Thomas Piketty's book. The phrase is intended to evoke the heightened inequality and the heightened empowerment of economic elites, which according to Krugman and Piketty both is characteristic of our era. For thinking about the issues at hand, this periodization strikes me as necessary but insufficient, and I hope that over the next couple of hours, other critical periodizations emerge. Lastly, the elephant in the room. Because I am still relatively new here, and because as a junior faculty member I am empowered but hardly invulnerable, and because the issue tends to cause people to dig in their heels in a way that renders productive exchanges difficult, in framing today's event, I deliberately downplayed the problem of Israel-Palestine. This choice may have been wise, it may have been absurd. What is the place precisely of Israel-Palestine in this mess? As an element in these events, are the politics of Israel-Palestine a fungible variable, or are they quite simply indispensable? I ask this question non-rhetorically, and I, for one, am exceedingly curious to hear what in this regard Dr. Salaita has to say.
Thank you, Josh. Good evening. As a historian, I was very pleased to read the letter written to Chancellor Phyllis Wise by the President-elect, and the immediate past President of the American Historical Association, dated August 31st, 2014. The letter, in part, read as follows, and I quote, "We find the procedural irregularities entailed in your decision to be deeply troubling. The recruitment of Professor Salaita was carried out with scrupulous care and adherence to prescribed procedure. The American Indian Studies program chose him as their preferred candidate after a national search. Every subsequent level of the university's administration below the chancellor endorsed that choice. His scholarship passed muster with your trusted colleagues. He has a record of teaching successfully at Virginia Tech, and by all indications, students of every stripe felt welcome in his classroom. By depriving him of that appointment, you do him a personal injustice. You also disrupt your own system of internal university governance." The letter continues. "Your open letter," that is to Chancellor Wise, "of August 22nd, stated that your administration objected not to Professor Salaita's pro-Palestinian stance on Twitter, but rather to the style in which he expressed it. Specifically, you held up civility as a necessary attribute of free speech in the university community. The insistence that all speech must be civil harbors serious danger for the health of our institutions of higher learning and of American democracy generally. The First Amendment protects speech, both civil and uncivil. It does so for good reason. The United States made a wager that democracy can flourish only with a robustly open public sphere where conflicting opinions can vigorously engage one another. Such a public sphere rests on the recognition that speech in matters of public concern is often emotional, and that it employs a variety of idioms and styles. Hence, American law protects not only polite discourse, but also vulgarity. Not only sweet rationality, but also impassioned denunciations. And I'll leave the rest of the statement for your own reading. You can easily find it on the internet. This is a strong statement by the American Historical Association. Yet, as strong as it is, I would have liked it to be even stronger. I would have preferred a statement that not only defended academic due process and the First Amendment free speech, but that also acknowledged, indeed applauded, activist historians as legitimate members of their profession and as important contributors to the political process. It would have been good for the leaders of the American Historical Association to have reminded us of the work that historians of foreign policy did in the 1960s to resist the Vietnam War, and in the 21st century to mobilize as historians against war in Iraq and Afghanistan. It would have been gratifying to be reminded of the civil rights historians who became active participants in the civil rights struggles, and of the feminist historians who not only wrote about, but actually fought in the women's rights movement. Perhaps most relevantly, it would have been inspiring to be reminded of the historians of South Africa who joined actively in the worldwide anti-apartheid campaign. In my own field of the history of medicine and public health, I can think of wonderful colleagues who have gone well beyond their historical scholarship to active political and legal engagement. David Rosner, for example, who took on the lead industry and has served as an expert witness in class action lawsuits. Alan Brandt, who has done the same against the tobacco industry. And Susan Reverby, an historian of the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, who uncovered the U.S. Public Health Service's horrific role in infecting unsuspecting Guatemalan men and women with sexually transmitted diseases. Professor Reverby was able to use her historical investigations and political energy to embarrass the United States government into apologizing to the people of Guatemala and into reassessing the protections we give to experimental subjects in studies that take place beyond our borders. The great role model for activist historians of medicine and public health was Henry Sigerist, professor at Johns Hopkins from 1932 to 1947. He not only wrote brilliant medical history, the best of his generation, but played a crucial role in creating and nurturing an active health left in this country and in providing leadership in various progressive health causes, most notably the campaign for universal national health insurance in the United States. Sigerist generated considerable controversy and was attacked viciously by red-baiting journalists, the American Medical Association, Johns Hopkins alumni and trustees, and J. Edgar Hoover and his FBI. He might well have been fired from his post at Hopkins if it had not been for the strategic intervention of the Rockefeller Foundation, as odd as that may sound, which funded much of his work and used all its influence to protect him. It's an interesting story for another time. But the president of Johns Hopkins still disciplined Sigerist with punitive, mind-numbing administrative burdens that plunged him into depression, ruined his physical health, and drove him back to Europe, from which he had been recruited. I've modeled my own career to some extent on Sigerist's, certainly in my scholarly work on and participation in the American health left, and in my advocacy of universal national health insurance. I've had some pushback over the years, but have gotten into no major trouble, and I've had no real worries about my career or my job. I've been privileged. But I've now gotten involved in a new scholarly project that may take me in a different direction. I am working with a group of international scholars, including several Israelis, on a comparative study of the early and mid-20th century use of X radiation to treat unpleasant but not life-threatening skin infections. This has led me to a deeper immersion than ever before in the history of Zionism, of mandatory Palestine, and of the early years of the State of Israel. Through that immersion, I've learned about the eugenically informed ideology of the biological regeneration of the Jewish people in some versions of Zionism, the campaign to heal the land of malaria and, by the way, of Palestinians in the 1920s and 1930s, and of the seemingly disproportionate radiation of immigrant Jews of Middle Eastern and North African ancestry. To sort these things out, I've had to learn about Israeli history and historiography, and especially about Zionist and post-Zionist phases. I've learned about the challenges facing post-Zionist historians in Israel, including attacks on their work because of its honest confrontation with the Nakba and ethnic cleansing, and I learned that some of these Israeli scholars have gotten into very serious career trouble. Some have been forced to leave the country, and all are under pressure in an increasingly McCarthyite political and intellectual environment that is Israel today. I feel that my own work in medical history needs deeper and more sophisticated familiarity with these now dangerous trends in Israeli historical scholarship. And in the interest of historical truth, as I see it, I believe that I have no choice but to pursue my reading and investigations wherever they lead. This may make me a persona non grata when I arrive in Israel in December, as I am currently scheduled to do, to continue work on my collaborative project. I think I may be under close scrutiny by Israeli security, not least because I have let my growing historical interest to develop into more informed views on current Israeli politics, and these more informed views have drawn me to the Jewish Voice for Peace organization, in which I am now an active member. So we will see what happens. But that is for the future. Right now, I am very glad to be part of this event and to add my welcome to Professor Salaita to our campus.
I have come to the conclusion that Professor Salaita's approach indicates that he would be incapable of fostering a classroom environment where conflicting opinions need to be given equal considerations regardless of the issue being discussed. So Robert Easter, president of the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, immediately preceding the Board of Trustees' 8-1 vote on September 11th not to approve Stephen Salaita's tenured appointment. As an experiment tonight, I will read Easter's statement as a condensed fragment reflecting a larger ideology, as, if I may, a tweet. In this close reading, I wish to expose the ordinary conditions that devalue classrooms and the teachers who staff them, the devaluation we see in this extraordinary case. Robert Easter doesn't mention students. In these certainly deliberate words, students are conflicting opinions that converge in a classroom environment. In this classroom, learning, content, and critical engagement have no place. Expertise and experience are not named. Teaching is called fostering, ruled by an unidentified approach. This approach, alone, without substance or form, potentially external to the classroom itself, indicates, though, a lack of capability. Students are not altogether absent. Robert Easter continues, I'm also concerned that his irresponsible public statements would make it more difficult for the university, and particularly the Urbana-Champaign campus, to attract the best and the brightest students, faculty, and staff, unquote. Students are indeed important, not as humans, but as recruits, consumers. In an era of shrinking government support, tuition dollars and alumni brand allegiance are crucial for market success. The success of brand Urbana-Champaign needs not inhere in, say, teaching or learning. It is measured by outcomes like enrollments, retention, donation, budget management, and growth. Classroom environments may lead to good outcomes, enrollment, retention, if, a la Easter and Chancellor Phyllis Wise, they don't judge or condemn viewpoints, or a la Carrie Nelson, they remain comfortable. Political speech, although unnamed by Easter and denied to be relevant by Wise, handicaps brand success and exemplifies the approach incapable. It polarizes, judges, condemns, and discomforts. But a political voice develops at all in an awareness that we do not exist in a comfortable free marketplace of ideas, that some ideas are better than others. Some ideas support murder and call it heroic. Some ideas mask oppression and violence, and political speech often seeks to expose those conditions through the vociferous rejection of the ideologies that mask them. The university as corporation, itself rooted in an idea that transvaluates exploitation and dehumanization, but to speak of that at all is indeed uncivil. In the academy, political speech is protected by tenure. A rash of dismissals and disciplinary actions taken against faculty in the early 20th century led to the creation of the AAUP, which in turn established guidelines for tenure to protect political speech and speakers. In the 1940 Statement of Principles on Academic Freedom and Tenure, principles that ostensibly govern hiring practices today, the AAUP maintains that, quote, academic freedom is fundamental for the protection of the rights of the teacher in teaching and of the student to freedom in learning. It furthermore stipulates that, quote, tenure is a means to a certain ends, specifically 1, freedom of teaching and research and of extramural activities, and 2, a sufficient degree of economic security to make the profession attractive to men and women of ability. Freedom and economic security, hence tenure, are indispensable to the success of an institution in fulfilling its obligations to its students and to society, unquote. Tenure is generally awarded based on years-long evaluative processes to determine the extent to which instructors have shown themselves to be capable, if not superlative teachers, and capable, if not superlative scholars. Actual students are not irrelevant. Their feedback is an essential component of a tenure track instructor's portfolio, itself evaluated by other faculty, both internal and external to any specific institution. The values sanctified by the AAUP, teaching and learning, figure marginally in the university as corporation or in Robert Easter's classroom, and tenure itself confounds neoliberal ideals. Tenure is neither efficient nor cost-effective because it may protect discomforting or contentious agendas that imperil brand success or outright reject the notion of classroom as marketplace, student as consumer. Tenure might stand as the last remaining vestige of university not as corporation. If the principles of tenure cannot be easily violated, to free this market from regulatory constraints, the university as corporation might just eliminate opportunities for its conferment, as it does. A 2009 Department of Education survey shows that 75.5% of academic laborers are contingent and not eligible for the award of tenure. This would include part-time as well as full-time non-tenure track instructors, adjuncts, and graduate students. But contingent upon what? Insofar as there are rarely opportunities for classroom or pedagogical evaluation outside of the tenure track, as reported in the Coalition of Academic Workforce June 2012 summary, such an instructor's continued employment is contingent upon factors necessarily external to the real classroom. Continued employment does not itself ensure economic security at all, as part-time and adjunct instructors receive a fraction of the pay and usually none of the employment benefits conferred upon their tenure track or tenured peers. And yet, the supermajority of classrooms across this country are staffed by such individuals, meaning that the supermajority of classrooms are neither ruled nor protected by the ideals articulated by the AAUP or need to derive their value from learning or teaching. The supermajority of classrooms are governed by corporate logic, expediency, cost-effectiveness, for which Robert Easter's classroom could be considered representative. Furthermore, most of these instructors never need to voice political dissent, disrupt student comfort, or upset brand success in order to face termination. Termination requires no justification, as the market justifies itself. Salaita's loss of employment at UIUC was met with outrage. Thousands of professors signed petitions decrying the treatment of their peer, and many criticisms of the UIUC invoked the 1940 Statement of Principles of Academic Freedom and Tenure. Luminaries in dozens of disciplines circulated or signed petitions or statements of refusals to share their academic labor with UIUC. Tenure protects their vocal denunciations and their continued economic security. I very much wanted to participate in these protests, but I could see no place in the disciplinary petitions for myself, or the tens of thousands like me, us classroom staffers, who could be fired for nothing, let alone participating in something disagreeable. And our economic insecurity, professional marginalization, and disempowerment makes the very gesture of refusing, for example, payment from UIUC or any institution at the very least incredible. With this in mind, I formulated a petition in the name of untenured and untenurable faculty. I hope the petition could concretize that while the Salaita case evidenced a violation of academic freedom and the subversion of faculty governance, the principles that govern these violations rule the employment or termination of the largest portion of our profession. The petition also allowed for anonymous signatories to make patent the degree to which our names, our teaching, our classrooms are, for the university as corporation, more or less irrelevant. Our names could be replaced with X's because our persons could be replaced at any time for something cheaper, less bothersome, or as often is the case, by nothing at all. The hypothetical classroom invoked by Easter exposes the university as corporation and the student as consumer, but these values are determinative in the majority of classrooms. The classroom values as espoused by the AAUP, teaching and learning, remain irrelevant for sustaining the university as corporation. For many, the neoliberal logic that overwhelms and devalues teaching and learning come to light in the Salaita case in the apparent disregard of faculty governance, faculty expertise, and the processes of evaluation that dictate the extension of tenure. But this disregard is already commonplace. The value of contingent academic labor only inheres in its price, cheap, and that it doesn't disrupt the pursuits of the university as corporation, budget management, or brand success. In other words, if we consider the grave misstep of UIUC and the violation of Stephen Salaita's academic freedom, we have to consider the reality that academic freedom is not coterminous with the act of teaching itself, but only bestowed through tenure. And insofar as only a fraction of college and university instructors in the United States enjoy the rights of tenure, only a fraction of instructors enjoy not only academic freedom, but, according to the AAUP, the sufficient degree of economic security necessary for the institution to fulfill its obligations to its students and society. This consideration is important especially for academic elites who condemn Salaita's treatment. Those who see in Salaita's case a turning tide, a chilling effect, a new precedent in the light of faculty rights, faculty governance, teaching, and learning need to realize that those tides turned long ago. Robert Easter's classroom is business as usual. For that, another relevant name besides Stephen Salaita's is probably James Kilgore. Thank you.
Well, much of what I was going to talk about has been said more eloquently than I would be able to say it. I have been here at the university for 30 years. I've been in the anthropology department. My own research has taken me to the Philippines and to Indonesia, where I began studying political forms of Islam back in 1988, when I was welcomed by former Muslim guerrillas in South Sulawesi as an ally in the war against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, right? So it was very convenient for me at that point that we were on a different side. The University of Rochester experienced a collapse of its endowment in the 1980s, and a major reorganization was put underway, and the programs that were targeted for downsizing on the corporate model were precisely the programs that taught about what is now called the world outside the United States. So comparative literature went, anthropology went, a number of other programs went, which is when I got involved in academic politics. I organized a chapter of the AAUP only to learn that according to a 1980 decision, I was a manager and therefore not covered by the National Labor Relations Act and therefore not capable of unionizing, unlike professors at public institutions. The real locus of any faculty governance at a private university like this turned out to be the faculty senate. So I and other members of the chapter then got ourselves elected to the Senate, and I served for a year as the chair of the Senate, where the major issues at that time were in the medical school, where people are meant to basically raise their own salaries, and even if they have tenure officially, basically served at the will of the vice president for medical affairs. So I spent, this is how I got into the history of the AAUP, which will be 100 years old next year. It was founded in 1915. Arthur Lovejoy at Johns Hopkins was one of the key ringleaders in getting it organized, and John Dewey served as the first president. But it was really Lovejoy who in the first year investigated 5 different universities for removing tenured professors, basically because of things they were saying off campus that annoyed the trustees, right? So right from the beginning, the idea that there is academic freedom has been something that has to be constantly fought for and protected. Freedom is never persists out of inertia. It has to be fought at every point. 4 years later, what's called the Palmer Raids took place at the end of the First World War, targeting largely anarchists at that time. Emma Goldman and many others, 10,000 I think, were deported. And that was the beginning of a restriction of the range of legitimate political speech in this country, which was really unusual. I spent 10 years in England, and in Europe generally, the range of acceptable political discourse is much wider than it has been in this country for the last 100 years. Political thought and speech has been policed here quite rigorously since the First World War. First it was anarchists, then it was communists, and was largely done by the state until the 1970s. And I think there's been a privatization of surveillance since then, which I'll get to. The AAUP did not cover itself in glory during the McCarthy period. There was the House Un-American Activities Committee, founded in 1938, became a standing committee in 1945. One of its most famous members was Richard Nixon from 1948 to 1950, when he broke the Alger-Hiss case. In the Senate, the Committee on Government Operations under Joseph McCarthy from 1953 to 1955 tried to root out communists from all branches of American life, but including about 100 faculty members. In the period 1949 to 1954, the AAUP failed to publish a single report on alleged violations of academic freedom and tenure. It just went dark for that period. Finally, in 1955, Ralph Fuchs became the general secretary of the AAUP, and in the next year, 18 reports on violations during the previous 8 years were finally published. So McCarthy went down in disgrace, but in 1956, the FBI set up the COINTEL program, right? But it was a little more covert, targeting socialist civil rights activists, later anti-war activists, feminists, Martin Luther King, all sorts of people. It's what Hofstadter called the paranoid style in American life. All organized from within the government. By the early 1970s, however, the political tide had turned. Mass social movements had broadened the range of acceptable political discourse quite a bit. And it was at this point that corporate elites began to fund private think tanks that would also provide a sinecure for people when the conservative parties were out of government. And this is what I think we're increasingly seeing today, that it's not actually the government who's monitoring what academics say in their classrooms. It's a variety of private networks that are funded by billionaire conservative tycoons. So yeah, there was the church committee that looked into the CIA malfeasance. But in 1977, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act was passed that would oversee procedures for the physical and electronic surveillance and collection of foreign intelligence information between foreign powers and agents of foreign powers. So there was a whole host of these think tanks that were set up in the 1970s that started to have their real impact in the 1980s. But American life was structured by the anti-communist crusade until the fall of the Soviet Union around 1990. And it was at that point that people began to search for a new enemy to be paranoid about. And increasingly it was Islam. So Daniel Pipes, for example, set up the Middle East Forum. In 1994, Bernard Lewis and Samuel Huntington began writing think pieces in the kind of middle brow press that was identifying an enemy that could be as threatening as the communist one had been before. And then in the wake of 9/11, suddenly, well, with the 2000 elections, a lot of these people who'd been in think tanks actually went back into government, and the government began to surveil people as well. After 9/11, thousands of Muslims were rounded up in very similar ways to the Palmer raids from 1919. Just kind of meant to instill generalized fear in a certain population. In 2002, Daniel Pipes' Middle East Forum founded Campus Watch, and for a while they were actually posting on the internet the names and institutions of professors who were speaking politically incorrectly. They were kind of forced to take it down, but not before several thousand academics requested being placed on their website in a kind of gesture of solidarity. Professor Salaita is not the first case of this. I invited to campus a few years back Juan Cole, historian at the University of Michigan, who had been offered a tenured position at Yale until there was a mobilization of networks to stop him from getting that position. He actually didn't even seek it out. I mean, they said, well, why don't you come over? And then there was, and again, in a very similar sort of way, the two departments, sociology and history, voted to hire him. And it was, there's a very arcane hiring system in the major Ivies. So there's some committee at the level of the humanities as a whole was where there was a vote. And again, he was thought, because of his blog, Informed Comment, to be too uncivil, although it's the most civil thing you can imagine, this blog. But he's still in Michigan, so I mean, he's not suffering quite to the degree. But it does indicate, each of these cases sort of casts a pall on the debate. Everyone begins to police themselves a little bit more, and one has to be prepared, I think, always to resist this. And with that, I will turn things over to Professor
Thank you, Ted, Lisa, Tom. I failed to say at the outset that we will have, a good 30, 45 minutes for collective discussion after Professor Salaita talks. But now, without further ado, the headliner. Thank you.
I'm going to keep my distance from the microphone a little bit. Can everybody hear me? Okay. All right. Good. Well, I'm doing something different than what I've done in recent weeks this evening, and that's instead of sort of reading a set of prepared comments. I don't want to say that I'm working on the fly, because I'm discussing a constellation of issues that I've been thinking deeply about, over the past few weeks, and indeed the past few months. But I almost feel like I haven't been left with much to say, because all the wonderful comments and analyses that precede mine. And so I thank everybody for their comments, and I think that I want to single out Lisa particularly and co-sign everything she said, although I'm in agreement with all the comments that came before, because as contingent faculty, it takes a lot of courage to raise that sort of critique. And it's as others have pointed out, it's not just my case that leads people to understand that recrimination for political views or for certain forms of critique that challenge power are part and parcel of the university, right? There's a reason why when faculty organize around a particular issue that the first thing they do is attempt to shield their junior colleagues, from having to participate. I've been in so many meetings ever since I got tenured where we're sending a letter to the administration or writing a statement for the campus paper, and within 5 minutes, right, the question of what do we do with our adjunct faculty and what do we do with our junior, that is our tenure track but not yet tenured faculty, and the consensus almost always is, well, let's leave them out of it, and if one of them decides to participate, we'll let that person participate, of course, but we're going to leave it to them and we're not going to pressure them. That's because a lot of university administrations have a heavy hand. So, that's just something to think about. But thank you all for coming, and I really want to thank the departments that have co-sponsored. It's a tremendous honor to be here. I do want to leave room for Q&A. My mind has a tendency to lead my mouth onto very long tangents, and I'll try my best to watch the clock and avoid doing that. But it's a gorgeous room, and those oversized chairs are extremely comfortable. So I'm going to make my measure of success, whether or not the people sitting in those oversized chairs are still awake when I finish talking. Those of you who are sitting in these wood back chairs, you have no excuse. Okay, actually, if you manage to fall asleep in one of those, then I just have to tip my hat to you and say that you're a world-class napper, and I can't begrudge you that. And let me start off with a qualification. I understand that the body of material that I'm dealing with tonight is controversial. Believe me, I know that it's controversial, right? Even before I got fired, right, I knew that it was controversial. I know that people feel impassioned by it. I know that people feel invested in it, not just intellectually or politically, but emotionally as well. And that goes for people who could be called pro-Israel, as well as for people who can be called pro-Palestine. One of the things I hope to do is to complicate those tidy categories, or at the very least not apportion those categories, right, into a distinct identification with a particular ethnic group. I want us to think more complexly about what it means to be pro-Palestine and pro-Israel. And I'm happy to argue with people. I've never been shy for debate. I've been discussing this topic for quite a while, but I do want us to also think about some broader implications. I feel like there's almost a script now, right? And I've been participating in and seeing that script play out so many times. A supporter of Israel will tell a pro-Palestine speaker point A, and the speaker will respond with point B, and there will be point C, D, E, and F, and everybody ends up pretty much ideologically anyway right where they began. And I understand that people feel the need to raise their points, but I'm going to try my best to situate my analysis of the conflict, right, directly into the context of what the speakers preceding me, right, have raised, and that's of academic freedom, right, the role of academics, social media in academia, and these sorts of questions which my situation has brought to the forefront. The speakers have already done a fine job of illustrating that these issues with which we're engaged are not new. They've existed for a very long time in American universities. I do want to highlight the ways in which these issues of repression have especially affected people of color in academia. African American professors and students have been dealing with administrative recrimination well before Palestine, became such a controversial issue on university campuses. Indigenous scholars, right? Indigenous peoples have dealt with all forms of repression and continue to do so. In fact, many of the disciplinary narratives of those associated in some way with ethnic studies are always in an uphill battle, not only for legitimacy, right, but also because some of the demands and conventions of the field are inherently activist, right? They attach themselves to material politics. They attach themselves to issues going on in the world. They don't see scholars, right, as we would like a nature photographer, right? They don't even have nature shows anymore, right? Not in the way that they used to, right? Even National Geographic has sort of gone the trashy reality TV show route. But if you've ever thought about a nature documentary, right? You know that the ethic of filming is that no matter how horrible, right, what's going on is happening, the camera person is not supposed to intervene, just to document, all right, and then present to an audience, and that's a form of objectivity, right? But and then that ethic continues to prevail in academia, right? That scholars and researchers, we document, maybe we interpret just a little bit, but we never intervene, right, in the conflicts and the populations of those that we study. But the very act of producing scholarship and research is an intervention, right? I think a lot of the ethnic studies fields, right, sort of claim that intervention and make it an actual part, right, of their vision of what a scholar can do, which is to engage material politics and change for the better the conditions of the communities that they study. That's certainly a central ethic to indigenous studies, right, and to American Indian studies. So the idea of studying native communities without some sort of investment, right, in the well-being of those communities is completely anathema to the field, right? And so that's true, I think, for a lot of folks who do work around Palestine, around African American communities, around transsexual communities, these sorts of things. There's an acknowledgement of intervention, right, and then sort of a demand to be invested in those communities that people are studying, and that's how I've approached Native communities, and that's how I've approached Palestine as a scholar. I have an investment there, right? I can't imagine myself being a scholar in any capacity without that investment, right? That's guided my work. That's guided my identity as an academic. It continues to guide my identity as an unemployed academic, right? Or as I've been euphemistically calling it, an independent scholar, right? Which I quite like, by the way. That's sort of the default identification for folks who don't have a job, right? Independent scholar. But I like it because of the word independent, and with a different inflection, I think it very closely identifies me in ways of which I'm proud, right? I'll always be an independent scholar, no matter where I'm working, right? Independent of administrative imperatives, independent of the commonplaces, right, of repressive language, right? Independent of the common sense of neoliberalism, right, of capitalism, of colonization, et cetera, et cetera. If I could tell you just a little bit about where I'm coming from personally, also, I think that might add an important framework, to what I tweet, why I tweet, and why I feel invested in it. My father is he's Jordanian. He's an immigrant from Jordan. I was born in the United States, in Southern Appalachia, in fact. don't have much of an accent, but you know, I kind of wish I did. Maybe a bit of an outlier in academia, even more so. But my mother is Palestinian, right? And I grew up in a what you could call a political household. We had political conversations, all right? Now, my parents didn't really indoctrinate me into any particular form of thinking, but what they did, and I think it's a wonderful thing that parents could do for their kids, is they encouraged the interest that I expressed, you know, in learning about the Middle East and, you know, in certain political issues. They were immigrants, you know, to a very white and black town in southern Appalachia, and so they pointed me in the direction of the racial politics of the town. I'll never, ever forget my mom sort of telling me all the time that, you know, when I complained about the xenophobia of our neighbors, and there was tons of xenophobia among our neighbors, right? Telling me that, you know, well, we have access as immigrants to a neighborhood, right, that black folks don't have access to, right? And it really sort of put into sharp relief the types of racial hierarchies, right, legally and otherwise, that exist in the United States. And it sort of set me on a path of thinking closely about a particular sort of racial politics and how it congeals, right, around sort of hierarchical modes of access and belonging, and then of course within the legal system. But when I became interested in Palestine, you know, my parents sort of encouraged that interest, right? I wasn't, you know, I wasn't what you could call a red diaper baby. I wasn't born with a nationalist, you know, with a flag in my hand, but I was encouraged, and I did learn, and I would go back and visit Palestine, and I saw the situation, and I saw my grandmother's, my mom's mom, my grandmother's hometown, which is called Ain Karam, right? Which sort of roughly translates, you know, as sort of a generous eye, I guess would be a very, very crude translation of it. But it's in West Jerusalem. All right. Now it's part of the municipality of Jerusalem, and it's an Israeli city. The famous Hadassah hospital is there. I don't know how much well you know the landscape of Israel-Palestine, but and it's right there near Yad Vashem, the you know, the Israeli Holocaust Museum. It's right nearby. In fact, you can sort of see all of Ain Karam from the museum's parking lot over the valley and the hillside. Well, my grandmother was displaced from her home in 1948. She became a refugee to Jordan, right? And she has never recovered her lost property. Nobody in our family has, right? It became property of the Jewish state, and now I don't even know what happened to it. I don't know if it's been torn down and new things have been built over it, or if, as was often the case, right, the Palestinian family was simply replaced by a Jewish immigrant family, all right? But the fact of the matter was she was displaced, right? She went to Jordan, right? She got her UN refugee card. She ended up subsequently meeting my grandfather, you know, getting married, and they ended up in the Western Hemisphere. But once I visited with a group, I wouldn't call us tourists, right? It was kind of an activist tour, but I visited the Holocaust Museum there, and I snapped some pictures, right, to bring back to my grandmother. And when I got back home, I very proudly, you know, said, you know, I have some great pictures for you. I want you to look at them. And, you know, her eyes teared up, and she refused to look at them. You know, she put them down and just slid them back to me. And of course I got the message, which is that this is not anymore where I grew up. I don't recognize this place, right? This place has been taken from me and replaced by something that to me as a native inhabitant, right, is completely alien. It's alien to my history. It's alien to my experience, all right? So of course I would get engaged with this particular issue. It's part of my very lineage, and it's influenced, right, the very identity of my family, as the conflict has, right, for so many, right, Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews, right? And then I understand that that's one of the reasons why there's such a depth of passion. But when I engage the issue, as I do often, it's with that history always in mind. I don't like to have arguments about who started the latest round. Did Hamas throw rockets first or did Israel bomb it first? Because to me, the conflict started with colonization and the conflict will end with decolonization. Everything else, right? Everything else is a mere function or outcome of this basic reality. All right. I also urge people to think about the issues at play in the University of Illinois' decision. And by that I mean, we're dealing with a whole bunch of things, but to put it in a simple binary, right? Whether or not you agree with my point of view on the Israel-Palestine conflict, or whether or not you feel like my language was too vulgar, right? And I have to roll my eyes at that. I'm sorry. I don't want to demean anything, but really, like I feel like there are so many sanctimonious academics out there that seem to be auditioning for the Ward Cleaver chair in sanctimony. Like cussing, really, like we're back in 1950, huh? It's remarkable to me. It's remarkable to me that became an issue, which to me tells you how pretextual it all is, right? You want to get rid of somebody, you find something, right? And if it has to be cussing, right? If you have to turn yourselves into a 1950s stodgy moralist, then I guess you have to do that in order to get the desired result. But anyway, even if you found my language too vulgar, or the politics themselves too vulgar, right? That's one thing. But do you believe that I ought to have been fired for it? All right, and then those are interrelated issues, but they're two separate questions. And I'd like to focus on the second question. I'm biased, right? I'm very biased, but of course I shouldn't have been fired. I didn't do anything that was worthy of that sort of outcome. Nothing, right? If cussing was a fireable offense, right, then there would be 25% less academics working in universities. If taking, if staking out a political position on social media, right, were a fireable offense, there would be plenty of professors, out of a job right now. But more than that, I want to impress on people the importance of faculty governance, which has become sort of a key term, being bandied about in this situation. I don't want you to think of it as an abstraction or merely as sort of a rhetorical ploy. It's more than that. It's the very foundation on which the American university operates, and without it, the university is in serious trouble. I was vetted by a department for a year. It takes a long time to get an academic job, right? A long time. I came in tenured at the University of Illinois. It takes even longer to get a tenured job, all right? From the time that I interviewed to the time my contract would have began, right? It was almost a 2-year process, all right? Almost a 2-year process. That's because the hiring committee had to decide who they choose. They had to get it approved by the dean. They had to get it approved by the provost. They had to get it approved by the chancellor, right? Phyllis Wise, de facto, right? Actually, no, de jure approved my hire. It was approved by a representative of her office acting in the name of and on behalf of the chancellor, right? So she approved the hire, all right? They had to get, because I was tenured, outside referees to look at my entire profile, my teaching dossier, my scholarship. They give it a close examination. I don't know how many they use because it's confidential, but normally anywhere from 3 to 5. And the outside referees had to weigh in and decide, okay, is this guy worthy of getting in tenured or not? I passed that round, right? So everything had sort of gone through. The reason that's important is because we need experts in their fields in charge of hiring, based on that expertise and based on the needs of the departments in which they're doing the hiring, all right? Take Christopher Kennedy, the chairman of the board of the U of I trustees, right? He's not only intervened in my case, but he intervened in the case of Bill Ayers. I don't know if you recognize Bill Ayers' name, but You know, he intervened in the case of James Kilgore, also who Lisa mentioned. You know, he didn't have the protection of tenure. He was adjunct, so it was a lot easier, I think, legally for the university to fire him. But there's a story that I keep hearing over and over and over again from Illinois faculty that tell me that when Mr. Kennedy was engaged in a discussion on contingent labor, somebody pointed out that the adjunct faculty at U of I make around $30,000. And his response was, well, per class, that doesn't seem so bad. Okay, you know, I take $30,000 a class any day, right? But there's a disconnect, right? There's these boards of trustees are not academics, right? They are not qualified to weigh in on hiring decisions, all right? They are largely lawyers and business people, and their function and their role and their charge is to run the business side of the university. There's a reason that their approval of faculty hires is a rubber stamp, all right? Because they don't need to be involved in hiring and firing. And the moment that they formally become involved in that process, all right, you're going to see faculty, right, or potential faculty hires vetted to a degree that anybody with any semblance of critical thinking is never going to get through the door in the first place. All right, you're going to end up with an extremely docile faculty. You're going to end up with the faculty, right, who has to explicitly articulate, right, a commitment to the imperatives of neoliberalism in order to even dream of getting a job in the first place. That's why faculty governance is important. It's not perfect, right? It has plenty of problems. I don't want to romanticize it, but it's a much better alternative, right, than people who think adjuncts make $30,000 a year, right, being in charge of this process, which is a complicated and difficult process. And it's a process, and, you know, faculty, come on, you know, faculty don't just go around rubber stamping things, right? It's difficult to get, there are probably more than 100 faculty at the U of I who either directly or indirectly approved my hire, right? You want to get, faculty on a search committee to agree that somebody is worthy or not worthy. It's a difficult thing to do, right? They don't generally go around rubber stamping things. They tend to be hypercritical, all right? And there's a reason for that, right? Because they know that inherently it's a way of maintaining a professional standard that's absolutely crucial to the well-being of the university. All right, so I just, you know, another thing that I've noticed, you know, in the months since the Board of Trustees decision, is that I feel like there's been a certain type of response among academics that is willfully ignorant and deeply contravenes the norms, right, and the standards of our profession, right? The first thing that you're supposed to learn, right, in college, right, in your 100 or 1,000 level courses, right, is the value of evidence. Right, the importance of evidence, right? That's something that I would always sort of drill into the heads of my students, right? You can make whatever claim you want, all right? I don't care. I need that claim to be articulated, right, with some sort of credible evidence, right, that sort of validates whatever it is that you're claiming. Well, the only I'm going to give you a list of all the evidence that exists that I create uncomfortable classroom environments and don't tolerate conflicting viewpoints. And I'm going to go ahead and sort of list them, you know. None. All right? None. Zero evidence. None. Not a bit. All right. So Robert Easter, Christopher Kennedy, Phyllis Wise, the Board of Trustees, right? They're lackeys throughout academe. Yes, that's an appropriate word here, not a hyperbolic one, right? They're carrying water for a very repressive and unjust administration, right? Which acted illegally, by the way, violated their own university's bylaws, right? They're making claims about my pedagogy, right, that has zero evidence, none. I've never had, in 17 years of teaching, going all the way back to graduate school, I've never had a single formal complaint about my pedagogy, not once, all right? I don't have any professional blemishes, all right? This is all speculation, but I feel quite confident that people affiliated with the university, right, or sympathetic to the university's actions, right, have probably been digging around all over the place trying to find such evidence, and they haven't found a damn thing, and they're not going to find a damn thing because none exists, right? It's not there. I invite them to keep on looking, and the reason I have that suspicion is because that's just how it works, but second of all, because you had people inside and outside the university that were taking screenshots of every single one of my tweets almost over the course of a year. When that didn't gain traction, they went to my Goodreads account and started pulling quotes off my book reviews. This is the God honest truth, all right? And so people are looking, all right, but they're not finding. So they're making claims without evidence. So you tell me, right, who's contravening the purpose of higher education, right? The administrators who are making claims willy-nilly, right, without anything to show for it, right? Or those of us, right, who have strong bodies of evidence to support everything it is that we're saying, right? So the sort of high-mindedness of the quality and the standards of academia rings completely hollow to me, right? It rings of hypocrisy. And speaking of hypocrisy, sorry, yeah, I could go on for a while, but no, Josh sort of, mentioned my role in the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions, particularly academic boycott. And it is true that I played a prominent role in the ASA resolution. I wrote a lot of articles afterward justifying the ASA's decision, and when I think back about the process, and I noticed this at the time, there was a serious shift in discourse around the Israel-Palestine conflict. Those inside the ASA especially, but then the scholars outside of the ASA who opposed the boycott resolution, I noticed, and you can go back and sort of read the arguments, they're there. They didn't contest the resolution on the grounds that we had gotten the Israel-Palestine conflict wrong. In other words, they weren't saying that there's no repression, right, in Palestine, that there's no military occupation, right, that there's no systematic, right, issues of colonization, right, in Palestine. They weren't saying that, right? They weren't contesting the reality that Israel acts in deeply unjust ways. They were contesting the resolution based on academic freedom, right? No, academic freedom is sacrosanct, right? We can't mess with academic freedom, all right? Academic freedom this, academic freedom that. Well, of the most vocal among the crew, Carrie Nelson among them, right? Not a single one of them, right, has come out, right, in condemnation of the universities by anybody's calculation is a brazen violation of both the legal practices and the informal standards of academic freedom, all right? So it's more than just hypocrisy, though, more than just hypocrisy. In opposing the ASA BDS resolution, right, they were also opposing academic freedom, just as in carrying water for the administration of the University of Illinois, they're continuing to oppose academic freedom. So there's a consistency there, right? And it works in two ways, that you protect Israel's interests and Israel's reputation, right, over these other trifling issues, number one, right? And you invoke academic freedom as a rhetorical tool, right, in any way that's going to supplement the first priority, right? And that priority is always first. Is this thing still work? Oh, I think I've
It's not a coincidence.
oh my goodness.
Maybe it's just early technology. Decided to like what's the story?
Yeah, that's very possible. Well, can you hear me in the back? I'll project, but please don't get on Twitter and start saying Salaita's yelling at us. All right, I'm yelling indeed, but I'm not yelling at you. All right, this gives me an ability, I guess, to walk around. So I'll move a little closer, and I'll try not to get any spittle on the kind folks in the front row. Here's a general rule that I hope deeply that faculty will adhere to, right? And that's that you don't voluntarily cede power to an administration just for the hell of it, or because of indifference or whatever. So folks in the STEM fields, that's science, technology, engineering, math. I think I got that acronym correct, right?
Yeah.
You know, well, why would they care? People are always asking, why would they? Well, they care because they're faculty. They should care, right? You're going to hand over more power to boards of trustees and to administrators? You don't do that, right? That's what people have been saying, right, ever since 9/11, before 9/11, right, about government policies and practices of spying and Guantanamo, et cetera, right? You don't turn over power to those above you on the hierarchy, right? They might not be abusing it in a way that affects you at the moment, but if you give them the opportunity to, sooner or later they will, all right? Either way, you don't want to take that chance. And so I think it's important for, for faculty, students, otherwise, right, to put aside, right, whatever personal feelings they have about the Israel-Palestine conflict and band together, right, as a particular demographic of worker, right? Do you want experts in their fields making hiring decisions, or do you want to outsource that task to the Simon Wiesenthal Center, right? People need to think about that, right? And I mentioned the Simon Wiesenthal Center because they've been caught having put pressure on the University of Illinois.
So the microphone will waterboard it if it doesn't start working.
No, I can't be party to that. I just a few more things, and then I'm going to open it up to questions and comments, if that's okay. Just like I can't separate my view of the world from my Appalachian upbringing, right, in which race was such a strong factor, and can't separate my view of the world from my grandmother's story of displacement and dispossession, I also cannot separate, right, my situation from the broader politics of Palestine, right? It would not only be untrue, but I feel like it would be watch movies.
I'm blaming the IDF.
It would also be an abdication of basic scholarly responsibility. The sort of pressure, right, that ended up bringing me down, right, has existed for so many who have commented, right, in uncivil ways, right, on the Israel-Palestine conflict throughout the past and certainly in recent history. I think that BDS has something to do with it. I think that Operation Protective Edge has something to do with it. That was the recent Israeli attacks on Gaza over a 51-day period. It led to around 2,100 deaths, and including 519 children. Right, it was just a horrible episode. The bombing of UN shelters, schools, et cetera, et cetera. Even the UN, right? The impotent UN deemed a series of Israel's actions to have been war crimes, and that's a judgment that tons of independent journalists and human rights organizations have made as well. Made under duress, by the way, because Israel wouldn't allow human rights workers into the Gaza Strip, right, during and in the immediate aftermath. But I'll tell you why. Because in a sense, Israel is losing the battle for hearts and minds, even in the United States, even among liberal media that could normally be counted on to sanitize or whitewash Israeli violence. All right, we really had a sense right, in the BDS community and otherwise I don't want to put it in the terms of in sports metaphors, but of winning, right, or Charlie Sheen metaphors for that matter, right? But we had a sense of making serious progress, right? Palestine had suddenly become legible in academia in ways that it had never been before, right? The resulting backlash, right, has been punitive, right, in the absence of substantive debate about these particular sets of issues, right? It's a silencing mechanism, and that all too often has been a default strategy of so many Zionist organizations. Don't want to have a debate. You feel like you're going to lose the debate. You feel like the facts aren't on your side. Shut it down, right? Let's not talk about it in the first place. Let's punish the people, right, who are trying to bring it up and speaking about it in ways that we find uncomfortable. And finally, American Indian Studies and my colleagues at the University of Illinois. And I will always refer to them as my colleagues. I don't care whether I ever work there or not. They'll be my colleagues. Brethren, in fact, in the American Indian Studies program. I got the administration, in order to justify its decision, invoked the terminology of New World colonization and of New World genocide, civility, natives. They didn't put two and two together, right? But anybody who was awake did, right? It's deeply problematic. And I don't just want to exist at either the symbolic or material center of this issue. We need to think about it in the context also of American Indian studies, indigenous studies, ethnic studies, the humanities and social sciences more broadly. We're all invested and implicated in this in some way. It goes far beyond me as an individual. I treat the university's decision not only as punitive towards me, but towards the department that wanted to hire me. So many people, right, in comment threads and other elsewhere are questioning why the department wanted to hire me in the first place. And again, lack of evidence, by the way. Well, he didn't have qualifications. Well, what the hell do you know, right? The hell do you know? Were you in the room deliberating with the search committee? I don't even know what they were talking about, right? I have no idea what their deliberations looked like. I just know that they chose me in the end, and I accept it, right? I don't even know anything about the process, and yet, everybody with an internet browser. Hello. Oh goodness. Oh. Okay. I appreciate it, sir, but I'm just gonna keep yelling. Is that okay? I'm just gonna keep yelling. It's more yelling, screaming. It's more suitable to my Arab disposition. I'm going back to something atavistic inside of me. What's that? Yeah, you're gonna have to go a little bit before that. That was a tangent within a tangent.
It was a sea tangent.
Okay, sort of an expert on the search committee deliberations, but
Indigenous studies.
indigenous.
Therein.
Yeah, thank you. I'm on it. Well, what is that tacitly saying about my colleagues, about the department, about the search committee? That they're incompetent, that they don't know what their own department wants, that they're corrupt, right? It's deeply, deeply insulting towards them. And I would say that it's tacitly insulting, but I would say it's not even tacit at all. It's deeply insulting based on the simple content of the critique, right? And the language of civility is doubly ironic on a campus, right, with an administration that for many years has been actively hostile to the American Indian Studies program, right, that continues to co-sign, right, the use of the Chief Illini and all the violent imagery that accompanies it, right, just last week during the homecoming game, I tweeted under the hashtag civility a picture of a sign, a big cardboard paddle outside of a fraternity house. Gut the Gophers, and then it had a caricature of an Indian, with the feathers and the big nose and the scowl. Well, that's quite civilized for the for the students. In this case, the word civilized actually is appropriate, right? Because
They're just frat boys.
What's that?
They're just frat boys.
Because it adequately symbolizes the relationship of that particular terminology to American Indian people in the first place, right? It's a terminology of violence. It's a terminology of conquest. It's a terminology of silencing, right? It's a terminology of deep, profound oppression, all right? So we can always point to various acts of civility, but civility of language on a social media platform is one thing, and there's certainly plenty that we can debate and discuss around that matter, but there's also the normative, right, civility of that exists, right, within the implicitly violent practices of both the state and state institutions that gets rendered normative, right, and that gets discussed in such a way as to completely downplay, right, the violent effects it has on other people. So many of the conversations we have out of hand about Israel-Palestine, for example, right, produce terrific violence vis-a-vis the Palestinian people and the way that we think about them, right? But that's considered perfectly normal, all right? David Lloyd, one of my colleagues and somebody I admire deeply, he wrote a piece early on about this situation, and he was talking about sort of the charge of civility because somebody, in this case me, was using strong language to express outrage, right, at a series of unjust events, a series of extremely violent events, right, a series of events in which people were getting killed by the dozen, a series of events in which the bodies of dead children were being stored in ice cream freezers because the morgues had run out of space, right? Of course I use strong language, right? It's a strong reaction. Not because I'm a violent person, but because I'm a compassionate person, all right? Because I have empathy for people who are suffering. I have empathy for victims of violence. That includes Israelis, by the way, all right? It includes any human being. But the normative violence of those who are supporting, right, the actions of the Israeli government at the time is expressed in perfectly polite language, reasonable language, and that's what makes its particular form of violence so insidious and so harmful and so difficult to identify, right? And that's what illustrates how the Palestinian body, right, is normatively marginalized in the spaces of academe. I'm absolutely weary of hearing about the safety and the comfort of Jewish students in my classes. Not only because there's no evidence to suggest that I would ever have and would ever mistreat them, but because it renders all Jewish people proto-Zionists of a particular sort, and it homogenizes them in completely unfair ways, all right? It applies a normative definition of Jewishness that is fundamentally exclusive of those who don't identify with the state of Israel, right? And there are plenty who don't, right? Tons who don't, right? Religious Jews and secular ones, right? But also, do you ever hear anybody ever asking, what about the comfort of the Palestinian student? What about the safety of the Palestinian student? What about the safety of the Muslim student who has to take the class of an avowed Islamophobe? And I don't want to even indicate equivalency, all right? I'm talking about this hypothetical, although we all know he's not hypothetical, right? Avowed Islamophobe, right? Or avowed devotee, right, of Likud, right? Or whatever, right? They're actually engaged, right, in forms of thought, right, that are inherently, right, discriminatory. I haven't done that, right? I won't cop to that, and it's something that I never want to do throughout my life. But nobody asks about nobody asks about the comfort of the African American student who gets pointed on all the time to become a spokesperson, for every member of his or her race, right? Or for the entire continent of Africa, right? Nobody frets over the comfort of the working class student, right? Who comes into the grandeur of academe, right? And doesn't quite fit, right, with its ethos and is having difficulty adjusting. Nobody ever talks about it. So when they're talking about students, all right, students isn't even a neutral noun, all right? Students assumes a particular sort of student, and that's a student who's normative. And the student who's normative doesn't deserve to feel unsafe or uncomfortable. That's something that the minority student, that the deviant student has to bear. I'm going to go ahead, though, and cut it off because I've been talking for a while. And thank you again. Thank you. I'll take questions.
Should I run interference?
Up to you. Yeah.
Or you could. I would ask. I'd like to get to as many questions as possible, and so let's just try to keep the questions relatively brief. But Steve, do you feel?
Yeah, I can do
Okay.
it. Let me go ahead for the sake of efficiency. Let me go ahead and take 3 at a time.
Okay.
And sir, please.
I just like to say that it's obvious to me that the issue is the Zionist organizations in Illinois that have put pressure on the University of Illinois. I know from personal experience, my brother, David Noble at York University, had the Israeli lobby in Ontario defame him, and he ended up suing. And I want to know, well, to me, it's obvious. I've seen this before. And to what extent have you identified all of these organizations that clearly are behind this, and what legal, what legal actions are you going to be taking? They clearly defamed you, etc.
Okay, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name's Amy. It's kind of a two-part question. The first question would be, can you expand a little bit more on the solution of decolonization and what that would include? And then the second question would be in regards to your answer, and it would be more towards if you decolonized an area and you kind of look at the equivalence of Native Americans, why do that sentiments Native Americans have against the United States aren't there wanting to be decolonized as well? I guess just to look at both sides.
Okay. Right. Is that it? Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
With the cost of secondary education in the United States continuing to rise and the university system becoming more and more a corporate business, what action or laws would you like to see academic activists take in order to begin taking back our universities in the pursuit of knowledge instead of profit?
Okay. I'll go ahead and try my best to answer these 3. Then I'll take 3 more. I'll try to keep it as terse as possible. Although that last question, that's really tangent worthy. That might, if I ruled the world, imagine that. There'd be a lot of actions and laws. As to the first comment / question, I certainly believe that there was a type of Zionist lobbying pressure. That's been made clear by the documents that have been released so far, and I don't think anybody's denying that. I'm not just using lip service when I say that Arabs and Jews share much in common, and that's one of those truisms. Oh, they're cousins. Well, yeah, of course, but we share something in common around the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's a sort of understanding. Very often it's an antagonistic understanding, but it's an understanding. Those engaged, right, actively engaged in pro-Israel activism, and those actively engaged in pro-Palestine activism know full absolute well why I was fired, right? Everybody knows, right? Everybody knows. We just happen to disagree, right, about whether it should have happened or not, right? But I cussed. I did this, I did that. I was fired for vocally criticizing Israel, right, for so actively and vocally supporting BDS, right, and for daring to have been hired at the same campus that unfortunately houses Carrie Nelson, right? That's why I was fired. But in terms of sort of what or who is behind it, I don't know. I tend to think that it's important to think about it just beyond just the act of a group or groups or individuals lobbying and sort of influencing administrators and getting what they want, getting the outcome they want. I think administrators in these corporatized universities like to be politically safe or extremely, as safe as possible politically. And I think they're wired in such a way as to supplement whatever default political norm exists in a particular moment. So it's not just lobbying, right? It's not just pressure, I think, that got me fired. It's because to speak so passionately, right, on in support of Palestine is to sort of position yourself on the political spectrum, right, in ways that according to an administrative mentality are so far beyond the pale of what might be considered civil, right? So it's a way of giving in to Zionist pressures, also a way of maintaining a particular status quo, right? It's also a way of illustrating that you can act responsibly, right? It's a way of showing, right, that you can be counted on to protect the interests of the state. And that very often is the job, even if it's not stated explicitly, of the university administrator these days. As to the colonization and what it includes, that's a really good question, a complicated question. Decolonization means different things to different people, so I'm not going to go on an exegesis on I probably mispronounced that on what decolonization means intellectually and materially, but generally in indigenous studies, decolonization is about reclamation of a land base that's essential to the sustenance of a particular culture, right? And a reclamation project also that would result in the practice of sovereignty, all right? Self-determination is another word that you can use, but sovereignty is sort of the lingua franca of American Indian studies anyway, although that term is contested too. But I think when a lot of Americans hear the word decolonization, they get images of angry Indians showing up in their backyard saying, okay, you have to move out of your house and go back to wherever you came from. But that's not at all what decolonization means. At its most basic level, it means the American federal government, as well as the state governments, right, adhering to the treaties that they signed once upon a time with the various Indian nations that exist in the United States. And there are hundreds and hundreds of them. It's not obviously a homogenous community. And so it's about treaty rights, first of all. Decolonization is about treaty rights. Treaties are legal agreements, nation-to-nation agreements that the tribes entered into with the American government, government-to-government agreements, right? And their stipulations exist in perpetuity, right? So, when a lot of angsty folks get pissed off about, natives having the right to fish or hunt certain territory or having the right to build a casino or this and that, like, look, the U.S. government ain't giving them shit. So you can drop the nonsense about the freebies and the handouts, right? These are what they are legally entitled to, along with other legal entitlements that are completely being ignored by one of the parties, right? And that would be the federal government. So that's what decolonization looks like at a basic level, right? It's an adherence to treaties that already exist and whose stipulations haven't expired. But otherwise, it's also I keep going back to the word reclamation, and maybe it's not the precise word to use, but I hope it captures the essence of what I'm getting at. It's reclamation of language. It's a reclamation of sovereignty. It's a reclamation of self-determination. It's reclamation of the project of nation building, right? It doesn't mean you depopulate right? North America of all its, European and Southern Hemisphere immigrants and repopulate it solely with Indians, it means that they get acknowledged, right, as the original peoples, right, of this landmass, of this continent, right, and that they in turn, right, are able to control their own destinies as nations without the interference or oversight of the American federal government or of state governments, right? Control their own destiny as they had done up until the moment that they were colonized in the first place, as they were doing for thousands of years before the arrival of settlers. That's decolonization. In Palestine, decolonization to me looks largely the same. Some people articulate it in the context of a two-state solution, some in a one-state solution. I try not to get bogged down in those particular debates, but to me, decolonization there is simple, all right? I go beyond one person, one vote. I'm happy to always say this publicly because it's an ethic that I want very much attached to my name. I don't want Jews and Palestinians merely to share a nation. I want them to share a national identity. And that's something quite different, right? That's something that I think forces them to work together, to become closer, right? To feel that their destinies on this particular landscape are intertwined, which they are. It's just a matter of acknowledging it, right? And coming to terms with that particular reality, right? That the Palestinians are not going to get displaced en masse, right? Unless Israel wants to murder, 4 million of them, right? Which in the era of Twitter is sort of a difficult thing to get away with, right? And Israeli Jews aren't packing up and going back to Poland, right? They're there, right? But in order to have a functional nation and a functional peace, in order to have a functional decolonization, all right, you cannot have legal systems, right? You cannot have political systems in which one group of people has access to an entire set of privileges withheld to another group of people for no reason other than their damn biology, right? Or their religion. Right? You got to get rid of that. Right? It's just outrageous to me that a state will call itself democratic, right? When an ethnocracy based on religion, and I don't want to mince words, based on biology, right, is the founding principle of who has access to rights and who doesn't, right? Now, if you want to support that project, you can support that project. I'll argue with you about it morally and politically, but support it, all right? But you do not also get to call the outcome democracy, all right? And to that, I would quote a person I disagree with more than anybody else probably in the history of the world, and that's Meir Kahane, the former JDL leader. He gave a rather stunning interview back when he was still alive to Playboy magazine, which is kind of a funny juxtaposition to me. I don't know why, but Kahane said that there's no such thing as Jewish democracy in Israel, all right? You either have a Jewish state, right? You either have a Jewish state or you have a democracy, right, where everybody gets a vote. And that's anathema to the very spirit of Zionism. And that's just Kahane's interpretation, right, of it. And of course, he was fully for that idea, right, that you get rid of all the Arabs, right, and you create a pure Jewish state. But to me, that idea of nationhood is horrible morally, horrible politically, and bound to fail in miserable ways, all right? But I agree with him in essence, right, that you can't have a state based on birthright, the apportioning of rights based on birthright, and call it a democracy at the same time. You want a democracy, make it a democracy. I support a democracy, all right? I don't believe in gerrymandering demographics, right? To me, it's more than unsavory that there is a very open discussion in Israel about Palestinian birth rates, right? And about demographic threats. That to me is the language of eugenics and the language of genocide. I'm sorry, right? That kind of conversation is horrible morally, right? So that to me is what decolonization looks like in Palestine, right? It's getting rid of the systems and structures in place, right, that prevent any sort of common ground for actual democracy, right? And working towards actual democracy where everybody, Jewish, Muslim, Druze, Christian, whatever, atheist, right, have an investment in the outcome of the state because they have the same access, right, to the rights of citizenship, right, that everybody else does. That to me is what decolonization looks like. Finally, in terms of the actions that this gentleman asked about, about the corporate university, sort of what laws or actions would I support? No, I mean, the answer could go on for a very, very long time. I'm better, I think, at identifying problems than I am solving them. It's certainly a weakness that I'll admit. People always say, "Oh, what should we do?" And I'm just like, I'm too laid back for my own good. It's like, do whatever you feel like doing, And then of course that's not what they're asking, right? But first of all, I don't know about laws. I'm deeply skeptical of turning towards the state and state authority as an antidote to any sort of injustice. I won't label myself with any political label. I like to think that I'm a political free agent in that way. But in that sense, I have a deep sympathy to some of the basic principles of anarchism, that I'm not interested in the state and the so-called justice system, and certainly not the prison system, right, as a means for solving our social problems, right? That's problematic. But in terms of actions, we need to think about, first of all, the pay structure, right? Let's go back to the University of Illinois, for example, because it's fun criticizing the University of Illinois. I got to get joy in life wherever I can find it. They're raising tuition again this year, right? Probably for the millionth year in a row, right? Adjuncts are getting fired and losing jobs, right? And even lower in the hierarchy, I think, than adjuncts are, the physical plant, the landscaping crew, et cetera, who don't have adequate insurance, et cetera, right? They live in many ways, a very difficult economic existence, right? Just because people have maybe a bad economic existence doesn't mean that they don't have a great spiritual or familial existence, right? And I think it's important to remember that. But they're living a difficult economic existence. And yet, Robert Easter is getting a $16,000 raise, right? Robert Easter makes already $550,000. The chancellor makes around $500,000. That's in addition to the $290,000 she gets from being on the corporate board of Nike, right? She's also on the corporate board of a local bank. Well, this is what administrators do. That's what we're talking about, the corporate university. It's literal, right? It's not just an allegorical process. So many upper administrators, university presidents are stuffing their pockets with corporate money. They sit on corporate boards. They get paid handsomely for it. All right. Everybody else, their salaries are stagnant, right? Their co-pays for their benefits packages keep going up and up, right? Their access to adequate health care, right, keeps getting harder and harder to access. So I think it's important to think about it as a basic labor issue, right, that's actually quite reflective of the economic realities of a lot of Western industrial democracies, including the United States, in which the so-called 1%, in this case administrators, right, are their situations keep getting better and better financially, right? For everybody else, it keeps getting worse and worse. So it's the first thing we need to look at. And do we really need a dean who makes $250,000 to $350,000 for everything? There's a whole bloated class of this sort of administrator now who does nothing but just engages in a lot of silliness. All right, you're gonna pay $200,000 for a dean who's in charge of student drinking. Do you know what I mean? It's like, really? I could complete that job in an hour if I had free reign. I really could, right? It's ridiculous. So the ranks of the administrators are getting bloated, and those administrators, you have to understand, have an investment, right, in the well-being of the university from their point of view. That's why they do things like cover up, child sexual assault at Penn State. That's why they do things like protect the quarterback and the coach at Florida State, right? That's why they do these things, because they're concerned, as Lisa kept pointing to branding, because they're invested in the brand, right, to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars, all right? Just like the economic elite in the United States, right, are invested in the militarized imperialist state right, to the tune of billions of dollars, right? So of course they don't want anything to challenge it. So that I think we need to look there. We need to look at the motivations of administrators. We need to look at the way that their ranks have swelled, and we need to look at their pay grade. But I don't want to let faculty off the hook either, because generally speaking, faculty tenured and tenure track are living pretty comfortable existences too, for the most part, right? I'm generalizing, but I think they also need to get engaged on issues of labor on their own campuses. They need to support their adjuncts in meaningful ways. They need to support the landscapers and the custodians in serious ways, and they need to quit worrying so much about their particular investment in the system and start living up, to some of the loftier standards, right? To which they would adhere in disciplinary ways, but are less inclined to do so when it comes to the practice of actual material politics. I promised I wouldn't ramble, and I completely lied. Do we have time for?
Take a couple more.
Okay. Yes, sir. Oh my goodness. Okay. Yes.
I just wanted to ask. I'm trying to think of a kind of a fun question along the lines of like, what would you do if you could do anything you wanted? And I'm also on the job market, so that might be influencing this question. But if you could teach a class, like develop a new course, that integrated some of the things that you've learned in the last several months, what would it look like? Or another way to think about it would be, if you could retool a course that you've taught before, right? How would you, with what you've experienced and learned in the last half of the year, right? What would it look like?
Okay.
If you had tenure now and you could teach anything you wanted, what would that? I'd be really interested, intrigued to learn how that would influence your pedagogy now.
Okay, thank you. Oh my goodness, I have so many hands up. I'll take two more, and I'll make my answers really quick. I saw the gentleman in the aisle, and I saw the gentleman there, and these are the ones I saw. I'm really, really sorry. I'm happy to talk to anybody individually afterwards. Yeah, go ahead.
I had 2 points I hope you would reflect on relating to academic freedom. The first is related to the idea, as you said, the university is a business, and for better or worse, that's the country that we live in. But something that I've been taught since I was in high school is to be weary of what I post on social media, because it will greatly affect my job opportunity in the future. And I was wondering, in your belief, to what extent you're potentially have to take responsibility for your actions and realize that this is something that was likely to occur.
Right.
Especially with comments which some would view to be inflammatory or offensive being posted to Twitter. And I don't mean the cursing, I mean the other comments.
I follow you.
And the other point I had was that I was curious what your idea of academic freedom was, relating to articles that you posted, one of which on November 20th of 2013, an article was submitted to an online website, the Electronic Intifada, titled "Why the American Studies Association Should Adopt Academic Boycott of Israel," and where you draw the line of academic freedom.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, yes, sir.
So let me say, I think your firing was both illegal and a troubling violation of academic freedom. I also think the Likud party is reprehensible, and as you said, I too would not be surprised if Benjamin Netanyahu came out wearing a necklace of teeth or whatever it was you said. That said, there are aspects of what you wrote that I find troubling, and it's not just the profanity, which I don't give a fuck about. What appears to me to be invocations of violence, which, as you've rightly said today, are far more often aimed at subaltern people than the dominant group. If we care about the fate of the Palestinian people, we should, reject this sort of violent rhetoric. So, in particular, you wrote, you may be too refined to say it, but I'm not. I wish all the fucking West Bank settlers would go missing. This was in the context of the kidnapping and murder of Israeli teens. You said this isn't about that. This is a general statement about the politics of the situation. But I come back to the qualification at the beginning. You may be too refined to say it. None of your other tweets had this sort of qualification.
I gotcha.
Makes me wonder, how does one read this?
Okay.
It isn't that, and why am I reading it wrong? And if I'm not, I mean, I've said plenty of things which I regret saying. Why not say, this is an awful, terrible issue. I said something that I shouldn't have. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. I'll answer these in order, and then we'll adjourn. The people in the somebody fell asleep. Okay, so public shaming is the only way to respond. The first question about the course I would teach. There's actually there's a really fantastic body of work now. That deals with the sorts of changes that we're seeing in higher education. That enough really to fill an entire syllabus, maybe even more. The titles escape me. I know Toby Miller wrote a book with Temple University Press that was good, and Thomas Frank wrote an article for the Baffler last year that I thought was really fantastic about these processes of corporatization, et cetera. But I would teach a class on. I might bill that class as sort of the maybe the economies of academe, or even bill it in such a way as to sort of highlight the discourses we use to relate to academe and governance and the role of the university in society at large. But what I would probably do is focus on those readings that are critical of the university, in ways that are comparable to my criticisms of the university, and sort of let the discussion flow from there. But I would deal with that particular body of material, and I might even throw in some. Actually, if it were an English class, maybe I would just teach a class on the genre of the academic novel. I always think that would make a fun class, even though like all of them are, and I love the genre. I was an English professor, right? And most of them take place in English departments, but they all have like prototypical themes, don't they? A horny professor, gets in trouble sexually with a student, right? Just really, really buffoonish colleagues, so maybe I'd just, go direct the students to David Lodge's Amazon.com page and say, order all of these books, and we'll go from there. But I actually like Richard Russo's novel about academia. I can't remember the name of it right.
Straight Man.
Yeah, Straight Man. So I would sort of mix it up in that way and make it, I hope, fun and informative at the same time. But the critiques of these sorts of things are pretty wide ranging. So you could probably actually fill in a 2-semester sequence on it. As to the role of social media and taking responsibility, I definitely get where you're coming from. All right. I do feel like I'm taking responsibility for it. In that I simply don't believe that there has been a compelling legal reason for the university to fire me, and I'm doing my best to be in conversation with those who disapprove of the university's decision in such a way as to create conditions that would make it difficult for this sort of thing to happen again. I can't take responsibility for it in the sense of saying, well, the university did what it had to do. I'm just going to accept its decision. I don't accept its decision, and I won't accept its decision. I just can't. All right, that's not only harmful to me, personally, but it's simply anathema to the entire set of politics to which I adhere. I think that it's important to remember that if you're looking for a reason to punish somebody, you're probably going to find that reason. And in my case, it was a particular discourse I was deploying on Twitter. But even then, I really want to point to the fact that like 6 tweets got isolated by a far right-wing hit site run by Tucker freaking Carlson, right? And they were circulated ad nauseum. And you know, I have like 9,000 tweets to my name. Do you know what I mean? You know, I'm an active goof off, obviously, right? I take my online playing around seriously, right? But there are tons of tweets, and it depends on the mood. Sometimes sometimes I'm hyperbolic, but everybody on Twitter is hyperbolic, right? Everybody. I mean, the platform lends itself to nothing if not hyperbole, right? Sometimes I'm thoughtful, reflective. Sometimes I'm really, really cheesy. So you could pull out 6 tweets that reflect any sort of mood, and sort of create a narrative about who I am, right? Based on a particular reading of it, based on an isolation from the mass. And so I can't take responsibility in the sense of accepting the university's decision, but I can take responsibility to think deeply about all of this, think deeply about social media, think deeply about my usage of it, right? Think deeply about how, about sort of what's involved and how people read it, and the ways that I might deploy language on social media in more effective ways. And this kind of starts to feed into the third question. But in the end, I believe that the university needs to take responsibility for the fact that it not only trampled on academic freedom, but that it abdicated the First Amendment. Right? It did. It's a public university. My political speech, everybody's political speech is protected. The university has admitted on numerous occasions, both implicitly and explicitly, that this was for the content of my speech. So whatever mistakes I've made, in my opinion, and again I'm biased, pale in comparison, right, to what the university has done, right, in terms of far-reaching effects for our profession. As to the third question. I get asked pretty often about that tweet, as you can imagine, and I'm glad to have raised in a space where there's more time than merely a 30-second soundbite. And don't take that as an implicit threat that I'm going to talk for a long time. I'll try to make it simple and to the point. It was expressed in such a way, right? No, I don't even want to use passive voice. I expressed my wording in such a way, right, as to lead people, right, to a particular interpretation, all right? And for that, I absolutely take responsibility, and to that, I regret it, all right? I do. I don't want to bore you. I'm not a violent person. Now, when it comes to violence and nonviolence philosophically, right? I wouldn't say necessarily I exist in the Fanonian tradition, but I'm not necessarily an advocate or a believer in philosophical nonviolence as a political mode of expression. I think the issues are way too complicated, but I'm not a violent. I've never laid my hand violently on another person, right? I rarely yell at other people. Tonight accepted, right? I just don't. I can't even like kill a spider in my house. I'll always sort of painstakingly pick it up and leave it outside. It's sort of a golden rule thing. I wouldn't want like some huge being to come and stomp me with a huge object that looks like a shoe either. So I figured I don't want to do that to the spider. But and so in that sense, I do regret that I worded it in such a way as to lead to that interpretation. But on the other hand, let me also say, and I know you don't have to believe me, I know some of you won't believe me, but that absolutely was not the intent of that tweet. I'm not a shrinking violet on Twitter. You know, I'm not passive aggressive. I detest passive aggressiveness. I say what I mean. All right. And if I would have wanted to express a desire that those settlers be murdered or kidnapped, then I would have said murdered or kidnapped. All right. I used go missing, right, in the context of this conversation over and over. I kept hearing that phrase, the West Bank settlers, right, went missing. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, hell, I wish all of them would go missing. Meaning is I wish they were gone. I wish they weren't there, right? Because it would certainly make the lives of the Palestinians, right, so much better, right? and so much easier. And in fact, would be a necessary step to ending the conflict. It was a way to sort of point to the fact that whatever else we want to focus on, the fact that Israel is settling the West Bank with people who in turn are making the lives of the Palestinians utterly miserable, right, is the source so much of the conflict, right? And anyway, that's kind of my explanation for that tweet. What I've learned to wrap it all up is that and it's something that I would certainly impart to to students in the audience, is that I agree with both of the last two comments. I mean, a lot of professors, I think, spend time telling students, be careful what you post on social media, but at the same time, I would also tell students and my colleagues, right, don't be scared to articulate something that you believe in deeply. You know, we are part of a community. I've seen the way that folks have sort of rallied around me and offered, material support, emotional support, intellectual support. People have offered me their homes to stay in. They've offered me so much, and so I don't feel like I'm going through it alone. And that the fact that we can create community in times of trouble means that we don't need to be as scared as we might otherwise be, right, to act on our beliefs and to try to make changes in the world that we feel are going to improve it. Thank you all for coming tonight, and I'm glad to continue the conversation with you.